Okay, we're here to talk with Heide Hatry about the wonderful portraits in ash that she's been making. And so the first question to ask is, Heide, what led you to the idea of making the portraits in ash?
On July 19th in 1993, I received a phone call that my father had died under very strange circumstances, which for me clearly indicated suicide. And I was in total shock, and I wanted to talk about it. Nobody would or could talk, and I felt completely alone with my grief. And my solution was trying to just not think about it at all. In 2008, 15 years later, I received a similar call. One of my closest friends in Germany had committed suicide. It was totally unexpected. I was in shock, and it immediately reminded me of my dad. And with that, an enormous amount of unresolved grief hit me. And I was utterly distraught. I didn't know what to do. And I certainly didn't want to get in a situation again in which I had been 15 years ago. But at that time, I was an artist. And I had been an artist for several years, and I made portraits out of beeswax. And I want to show you, I had a board of wood, which was covered with beeswax, and I placed pigments on the beeswax in the shape of a face and covered that with another layer of wax and another layer of pigments and then another layer of wax. And I built this up until it looked realistic and even a little bit 3D. I have actually a picture right here where you can see this, a picture made out of wax. You can see the glossiness a little bit. It looks now with the light a little bit like a doll, but it is a relatively realistic picture. And it is made, I was talking about these pigments, and it is made out of pigments. I don't know if everybody of you has seen pigments. They look sometimes like sand, sometimes they are a little coarser and look like dust. And I realized that this is cremated remains, looks just like pigments. And therefore, I had this idea to combine that. I could make his portrait by using his ashes instead of pigments. And it took me many months to figure out how to make that, because I had this clear idea of how it should look like. I mean, I had this idea that it's like a grainy photograph from further away, but if you would go closer, you would see like a sandy surface of these pigments. And in order to do that, I had to have dark and bright pigments to work with it. And I realized that inside of the bone, it's a little darker. Outside of the bone, it's a little brighter. And so I separated all these pigments into different shades of gray. And then I inserted the single particles with a scalpel into the surface, which I had slightly heated so that it becomes a little bit sticky. And what I basically did was creating a mosaic. And I covered the entire surface with thousands of particles. And the wax, you couldn't see anymore, only the ashes were visible. And at the same time, I tried, of course, to achieve an exact likeness of my father and my dad. And I want to show you how that looked like. It looks like this is my friend Stefan. And this was my dad.
So I wanted to ask how the power of these images relates to a question that art historians have been thinking about a good deal lately. They've been worrying about representation. They've been worrying about likeness, what makes something like something else. If Picasso makes a picture of Dora Maar and she's only got one eye, is this like his lover or not? And it struck me in thinking about your portraits in ash, that what you've got is sort of radical likeness and radical unlikeness, and that this is part of the power. These are portraits made from photographs, so they are very like. At the same time, the power of the fact that they're made from ash is that this is the real person. It's not like the person at all. The ashes are the person. And so you've got likeness and being, if you will. You've got what the philosopher first would call icon and index. You've got likeness and you've got the thing itself combined in these very unique objects that you've made. And I wonder if the thinking of it as, if you will, likeness and being, if that's any help in thinking about these portraits.
This is actually exactly what I think is the interesting thing about these ash portraits. Sorry. I was asked before why it is so important for me to replicate the face. Why be so literal? And in my opinion, it's necessary that the portrait is realistic, as realistic as possible, because the face is where we understand communication is happening, and the face is the template of for capturing all subtleties of what makes us human. So an ash portrait is the representation of the person, meaning you can recognize him or her because of the likeness, but at the same time, it is made out of that person's ashes. And that means it is actually that person. And at the beginning, I thought the long contemplative process of making the portrait made me feel so extremely consoled and comforted. But I realized later that that wasn't true, that I found when I had the picture, I found the picture itself is consoling. The presence of the beloved one is consoling, meaning the ashes itself are consoling. And that is the reason why I actually can make these portraits for other people to help them with their grief, because they don't have to go through the process. They don't have to be able to make this kind of likeness. They can have just the consoling benefit in having that portrait. Caroline, can you say something about your medieval reliquaries, and if or are they also both like or not like?
Yes, when we first did our conversation together 2 years ago, I was asked if I could make some comments from the standpoint of a medievalist who works on various kinds of ways of memorialization and remembering, and especially on relics. And one of the things I did was to talk about a reliquary which is here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum. I hope I can show you the image. Yes, this is the Mary Magdalene reliquary in the Metropolitan Museum. You can see here the fragment in the center is the Magdalene, supposedly the Magdalene's tooth, and it is in rock crystal, a very hard substance, the hardest substance that they had in the Middle Ages. And at the same time surrounded by these wonderful elements of foliage that are unfolding, that are organic, that are living, that are fertile. And I think there are some parallels between this kind of thing and Heide's portraits in ash. Now, obviously, this is not like the Magdalene in the same way that the portrait of Stephan is like Stephan. But one could say that to somebody who came to Stephan's portrait, it might not seem to be Stephan, because they might have known another Stephan, a Stephan at age 2 or a Stephan at age 14. And so the fact that the portrait freezes one moment in Stephan's life might have seemed unlike as well as like to them. And I think then that there might be some parallels to the way in which this is like and unlike the Magdalene. Obviously, her tooth is not the Magdalene. We don't know what Mary Magdalene looked like, but there is an element here that is indexical, that is really the Magdalene. It's the stuff of the Magdalene. And at the same time, there is an element of likeness in another sense, the sense in which the portrait of Stephan is comforting to Heide, and a portrait from another time in his life might be comforting to someone else, in the way in which it makes it alive. Because the interesting thing about the reliquary, and this is often true of medieval reliquaries, is that in a sense they make the person eternal. Because what we have here is the Magdalene made eternal in the sense of the hard crystal, to endure forever. And at the same time, the unfolding, the organic, the flowering, that presumably is also part of the life in heaven, which unfolds forever as a kind of way of the soul sort of blossoming. So I think there is a sense in which the medieval reliquary is like and unlike. It is the person, and at the same time, it's very much a construction of the person in ways that are comforting. There also are other Christian implications that I don't go into, but at the same time, I think anyone praying before the reliquary of the Magdalene might have some of the same kind of feelings that those who loved Stephan would have in front of the portrait in ash that Heide's made. I don't know whether that carries any significance to you, Heide, but you might want to jump off from the reliquary.
Yeah, I like the idea of a reliquary retaining ashes, or retaining a
fragment, yeah.
Right, which is actually more customary with Europeans. And I don't like scattering ashes, which is more popular with Americans. For me, scattering the ashes feels like throwing them away, or denying us access to our beloved ones. And I remember we talked about that before, and I was very impressed by what you said, and maybe it even changed my, not maybe, it even changed my view of that. But can you tell us what you like about scattering ashes, or just about scattering ashes?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting sort of European-American contrast, in that in many European countries, you're required to buy an urn and a place in a columbarium, in other words, you're not allowed to scatter. In this country, one is allowed to scatter. Just down the road from me in Riverside Park, we are actually permitted to scatter ashes. This is part of the notice. You're not allowed to put them in water in the park, but you are allowed to scatter them in the grounds. And when my husband died 2 years ago, I scattered his ashes in the Hudson River, right in the middle where the current was. One of the reasons I did this is, of course, because that's what he wanted. And I think if one knows, it's helpful to be able to do what a person wants done with their bodies. But another way in which I think scattering, and in this case, scattering in water, but it can be just as much scattering in earth, it's giving the person back to the fertility of the world, a world which is at the moment for us very, very fragile, and which we hope will go on and be fertile. So there's a way in which scattering is giving the person back to the soil, the ashes, the earth, the planet from which ultimately we all come. Of course, in the Christian tradition too, there is the notion of the Last Judgment, and we have all sorts of powerful works of art and works of poetry in the Christian tradition, in which when the last trumpet sounds, the angel puts the person back together, no matter how far the fragments have been scattered. I think most people today find it very, very hard to encompass that in their mind. But I think there is a sense in which in the long Western tradition, maybe even scattering to the wind, scattering to the water, scattering to the earth, is not so much of being lost or being thrown away, although I can understand why it might feel like that, but rather a kind of a joining, a kind of return, which would ultimately also have to do with some kind of reassembling or putting back together, or sort of joining the earth again.
Yeah.
So that, I think, that talks a little bit about the power of scattering, but I think there also, of course, is a power in retaining. And you, I think, might want to talk a little bit more about why having Stefan present, having your father present in the portrait is important and moving.
Yeah, I never thought that I would find scattering the ashes moving. And it really changed our conversation, really changed my view of it. I think my portraits are a very special way of keeping the person present to those who loved him or her. But I don't believe that it doesn't have, I mean, it doesn't have to be that in that form. It doesn't have to be in the form of a portrait. And obviously the place where the dead still live is in our memories. Therefore, you could argue it doesn't matter at all. But for me, it does. And I feel like one potentially powerful access to memory is abandoned by scattering. And we have talked about that. And I found a kind of new argument, which we didn't talk about. And therefore, I want to ask that. Why do we have museums? I believe that there is an emotionally something in us that requires verification. Like objects are witnesses to an existence. We understand that these people or their objects actually existed in such a place or time, and we think that's the reason why we hold. I think that's the reason why we hold on to them and exhibit them and have them in museums or in our homes as witnesses. And I think an Icons in Ash portrait is a witness to that person, the truth that this person actually existed. Yeah. And there is even in the ashes, there's even the DNA, and it's the real thing. And another point I like about the portraits is that I'm returning these indistinguishable ashes into the particular. Mm-hmm. I think that is, I think that's beautiful. And in some ways, a lot of my work is about this reliteralizing, trying to return to the traumas or to the site of the traumas that have been subsumed in culture. And it seems to me to be a way of keeping alive what is always in danger to be lost or forgotten or ignored.
I think you're right, and in several ways. And I have to admit, even with the issue of my husband's ashes, After the scattering in the Hudson, I did save a little bit. And my daughter and I dedicated a bench to him in Riverside Park. And when spring came, I put the little bit of ashes that I had saved under the bench, so that the bench would be a place where I could go and sit, and a special place for locating memories, which is, of course, what the cemetery used to be. But now I think for modern Americans who travel so and move so, you can't really take a cemetery with you. Of course, you can't take a bench with you either. And one of the powerful things about portraits in ash would be you can take that with you. So this object of memory. And I do think that, Heide, you're absolutely right, that it is objects that carry memory for us. I still have hanging in my closet one of my husband's shirts. My cats, who missed him after he was gone, one of my cats went into the closet and tried to pull the shirt off the hanger. I think he was trying to find this person whom he had loved by pulling down the shirt. So I think objects do carry, and this, of course, is important about the medieval reliquaries too. They carried, and sometimes, of course, there are wonderful stories about how bones and other objects flew through the air and chose a place to be so that they could arrive and be there for people who wanted to retain memories. So yes, I think all of us want some way in which we let the people we love go. Mm-hmm. I think we have to let them go, let them join a whole stream of history and of experience. But at the same time, I think you're absolutely right. We need to hang on to.
Yeah, my goal is actually to keep somebody permanently in my company, or that people can keep somebody permanently in their company, in the way that person looked like, and in the way what we have left, and if people have actually the ashes, that is just the closest thing. And I understand this coat and clothing that that is an access we have much easier, and you don't have to do anything with that. But I also want to emphasize that what I do is an artwork, and an artwork has in general quite a strange relationship to us. So when we, for example, live with an artwork, much as with an actual personal relationship, we grow into it. Our relationship changes, and one day we might discover that the relationship that as it had existed is different, and we don't even discover that the relationship is different. It's just different. And I think these portraits tend to become part of our lives in that way, not desperately clinging to something that can no longer be, but a natural extension into the future of an important past. And the change, I think, happens in us, not in the thing, but we see it differently as we change. And you can, of course, argue that the scattered person has returned, and you said that before, to the universe, and it is in nature now and doing something there, kind of continues with life. And I think some people think that I'm anxious to that the physicality of that person escapes from me. I of course understand that the person is dead. I understood that very, very much when I worked with the ashes. But I think a portrait adds something to my inner personal life. Like maybe like the scattered molecules add something to nature. It's a new perspective or a new relationship. And you could see my portraits maybe as a help for a transition. And it might not be for everybody. It's a specific way addressing profound grief, I believe. And maybe somebody is not ready for consigning the molecules to the nature yet. And for them, it might be better to have this portrait to get kind of from an emotional state to a kind of balance. I'm rather saying that it's not death and life. It's not this black and white thing. Death is a kind of slow mutation of life into a different sort of relationship. And what I like about my portraits is that death becomes a part of your life, instead of something that you just abandon or say it's over. It's, for me, it's a different way of saying goodbye in a kind of slower way.